One of our customers sent in a request for a video, why the quad? So Mike and I thought we'd go ahead and talk about why the quad when it comes to flying a paramotor. Mike, how would you answer that for our customer?
Well, the question was, or often is why would I want a quad versus a foot launch? And typically, it's those guys that are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and in some cases, their 70s. They're not built the same way that they used to be. They're not in the shape that they used to be in, or they've had previous injuries, or they don't want to get injured. Quads are much easier to learn on and much, much safer.
Okay, so Mike, why the quad? I used to see trikes, but there are more and more quads now out there being flown by people. Why 4 wheels versus 3?
It really comes down to stability. Many of us older guys remember in the 80s when Honda and Kawasaki were sued for almost $700 million for their 3-wheel ATVs. Those 3-wheelers are very tipsy. And the problem is that when you do tip them over, you don't go to the side. You're thrown forward and to the side, and it's virtually impossible for the machine not to run you back over. The thing that we need to add to that is the fact that we've got a 30 or 33 square meter crowbar, i.e. the glider, above your head. That makes it much more dangerous. If a quad begins to tip, let's say to the right, the left rear wheel will unweight, and that weight is transferred to the front right. That front right wheel pushes back. Trikes can't do that because there is no front right or front left wheel.
Okay, so the stability factor makes complete sense, as I've seen it firsthand at various fly-ins, things that happen to people on the trikes versus flying a quad. I mean, just being able to taxi up and down the field on the quad seems to be a lot easier. But what are the other advantages?
As I mentioned earlier, age has a factor here. Older guys don't put things together as quickly as the younger guys do. The quad is much more forgiving than a trike. It allows you to make mistakes, correct those mistakes, and go about your business. It's much more user-friendly for the everyday Joe.
Okay, so I noticed that with your quad, the length and the width are almost exactly the same. Why is that?
When I originally designed the LowBoy Quad, I kind of brought in my catamaran sailing, my Hobie Cat sailing, where the boat is very wide and more relative to the length. The quad is only 2 inches longer than it is wide. Stability is everything. Remember, we're trying to take an average Joe and turn him into a pilot and do so safely. The only thing that he wants is to fly low, fly slow, land with a smile on his face. That's it. So stability to me was really important. The quad is 2 inches longer than it is wide. It's pretty hard to flip a square.
One thing I've noticed over the past couple years is the number of really big guys flying quads. Why is it more difficult for a bigger, larger guy to fly?
PPG, powered paragliding, is a weight-sensitive sport. The bigger the guy, the bigger the motor, the bigger the glider. Also, you must consider altitude. If somebody's flying at 8,000 feet out of Colorado, for instance, or New Mexico, there's not as much oxygen. They need a bigger glider and a bigger motor.
So explain to everybody then, what larger motors do we have available for these guys that weigh over 230, 240 pounds?
Well, if you're up to 220 pounds, I'd go with an Air Max. It's a great motor, inexpensive. Your next step up would be the Hellcat 4-stroke, which is 36 horsepower, guys up to 260, 270, 280. And then the Revolver, 44 horsepower, is for the really big boys. Again, you must consider your altitude. If you're at 5,000 or 6,000 feet, go with the 4-stroke or the Revolver versus the Air Max.
One of the things I noticed is that other manufacturers do not have these larger motors available for their customers.
That's very true, and I think that's why we've positioned ourselves, and we're now in the position where I'd like to see this company. You know, 50% of our sales are quads. 50% of our sales are to the everyday Joe. We're not catering to just foot launch. We're catering to what the public or the consumer wants to see. And 50% of those guys want to see quads. They want low and safe.
So with these larger guys flying the quads, what advantages do they have flying a quad versus a trike?
That's a really good question, because that is very important, is the strength of the unit itself. The LowBoy is made from chromoly steel. It's very lightweight, yet exceptionally strong. All the other manufacturers that I know are using aluminum. A big guy on a hard landing will break them or bend them. We have never bent or broken a LowBoy chromoly component. Never. Axles will break, $35, take you 5 or 10 minutes to replace. But the LowBoy itself takes a beating.
Okay, so we talked about the larger guys and landings, whether they're easy or hard, but what about the impact of guys that are lightweight?
Strength is relative. Yes, a bigger guy weighs more and he's going to have more impact on the machine when it has a rough landing, for instance. I'm 165 pounds. I can still have a very rough landing, and I know for a fact that if I was on some lightweight aluminum quad, for instance, that I'd be looking at damage that I wouldn't be flying for a while. I'd have to go get new parts or refabricate some parts. In the LowBoy, I can have a hard landing, and if anything, I break an axle. $35 and takes me 10 minutes to replace. I'll take the strength over lightweight any day.
I noticed that with the quad, you have more of a bucket style seat and a seat belt setup versus some of these other trikes have more a harness look. Explain why you went with this style.
Yeah, they'll utilize a harness like a free flight harness that's strapped to the cage and your wheels are underneath you. A little bit lighter in weight, certainly not as strong, and again, very difficult to get in and out of. The seat belt with the bucket seat that you mentioned, you get in it, you clip on the lap belt and go fly.
So when it comes to flying a paramotor, those that have a foot launch unit, the transportability is fairly easy. But when it comes to a quad, talk about its portability.
Well, you're correct. It's not as easy to transport. But let's look at the facts. The bigger guys, the older guys, are not going to foot launch. So what have we done to make the quad transportable? Right now, as it sits, it slides right in the back of a standard size pickup truck. On each of the 4 axles, we also have removable pins. So you can either slide the axles out or slide them in for a smaller size pickup. Trailers, a lot of guys are using little Harbor Freight trailers, using the motorcycle ramps on top of them where they bolt them to it, roll it right up, cinch it down, and away they go. I've actually seen a guy with a Prius with a little Harbor Freight trailer pulling his quad. So there's ways to figure out the transportability and ways to make it work. As far as launching goes, you can get off the ground in a quad pretty much the same distance as you can with a foot launch, and landing, same as well.
So you just mentioned the amount of room needed to take off and land in a quad, and you suggested that it can be almost the same distance as a foot launch. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
On a quad, you want to taxi. You want to exhibit your ground handling skills, so to speak. So you're going to accelerate forward, the glider will come up above your head. We would like to see you ease off the throttle and taxi down the field, balancing the glider directly above your head. When you're ready to launch or take off, add throttle, continue to balance the glider, and go fly. In the event I need to get off the ground in short distance, in a 3 or 4 mile per hour wind, I can be off the ground in less than 50 feet with the quad. It's not how I'd like to see people launch their quads, but it's certainly possible.
Okay, so what about the landing?
Really the same thing. If I need to come in and flare a little bit harder and drop down, the quad will certainly take the impact, and I can stop within 10 feet on a quad. If I want to simply touch down gently, glide it out, bring my glider down, we're looking at about 50 feet. If I want to touch down, taxi for a little ways, like I can actually taxi over, or a lot of the students here can actually taxi over to their vehicle and bring their glider down where they want to bring it down. What's nice about a quad is you can drive that thing all over that field as long as you've practiced those handling skills.
Okay, so with ground handling skills, as you mentioned with the quad, I've seen guys down in the field, including yourself, doing figure eights, snakes, 360s. In fact, I think there's a video of you herding cattle with your glider above your head on the quad. Tell me about that.
It's just practicing. It's one of the fun things about a quad. When the beginner pilot is actually flying, he's got 5 or 6 flights under his belt, we'll have him touch down at the beginning of the airstrip, ease off the gas, and taxi down the strip, and then launch again. We call it a touch and taxi. The next thing we'll do is we'll have him touch and snake. That's where he touches down, he steers left with his feet, left with his hands. right with his feet, right with his hands, and just does snakes down the runway. And then he can launch when he wants to. After a while, they'll want to touch down, go down to the end of the runway, and maybe do a 180 and come all the way back to the beginning. And if they can, do another 180 and go relaunch. There's a lot of fun things that you can do with the quad, but that's your handling skills while you're on the ground. The more you practice, the better you get, and the better it looks. If it looks good, it is good. If it looks like poop, it's poop. So make it look good.
Okay, so what kind of wheel options do you have for the quad? Because I know there's guys that are flying these all over the world in all different kinds of terrain. We've got guys in Africa even, and we've got guys overseas that are using these commercially. So what kind of wheels can a customer get on a quad?
The standard wheels that come with the quad are a polished aluminum with enclosed bearings. They're a little bit smaller in diameter. They're about 10 inches tall. The next size up is a non-rib tire that's 3 inches taller that allows you to roll over larger obstacles and so on. The bigger guys, the guys that are flying in and out of uneven terrain, that's typically the wheel that I would recommend for them. Last but not least is the beach tires, 42 centimeter tall, very big, very round. 2 or 3 pounds of pressure in them is all you put in them. Those are for like your sugar sand on your coastal areas. The other wheels and tires will not launch the quad very well in that sugar sand. However, the big beach tires do a very good job of that. In answering your question regarding abroad, Africa, for instance, we have a number of commercial operations like gold mines, diamond mines, game farm estate management. They go with the bigger, taller tire, not the wheelies tire or the beach tire, but the bigger, taller tire. And some of them even fill those tubes or tires with foam. That way they can't have any punctures.
Okay, so with these quads, we have a lot of questions about tandem use. I know that the regulations here in the U.S. are different than those in other countries. So explain tandem use in the quad.
Tandem technically in the U.S. is illegal. The only way you can fly tandem under FAR 103 is to get your vehicle end numbered, which means you'd have to do like a 50% build is one way to get that accomplished. And of course you're going to have your sport pilot license or a regular GA license to do that. Many other countries, whether you go single or tandem, is irrelevant. They don't have any regulations inhibiting you to do tandems. We have a number of commercial operations that do flying up and down the beach, taking for people for rides, pulling banners for cell companies and stuff like that. We also have the tandem configurations that are used here in the States where they mount a box to the front of the quad and store equipment or supplies in there. There's a number of hunting guides that use them. They camp out of the quad, for instance, and they'll put a lot of their supplies in the front.
I noticed here on the quad that you have dual tanks. Why 2 tanks? What kind of flight time can you get?
Cross country is becoming more and more popular. So we have a lot of fellas that are flying these quads over long distances, over 100 miles. So having the dual tanks leaves you with that feeling that you have enough fuel for sure. Often these guys don't know where they're going to land. So in order to find a good place to land, perhaps they might have to go further to reach a certain goal. So the extra fuel is necessary. You cannot carry more than 5 gallons of fuel per 103. The dual tanks put you right at 5 gallons and gives you approximately 4 hours to 4.5, 5 hours of flight time.
There's been a lot of question about reserves, whether to fly with one or not. And I understand there's guys that like to fly low and there's guys that like to fly a lot higher. I see the quad here has a reserve mounted on a bracket. Explain to me the reserve on a quad.
The reserve on a quad works exactly the same way as it does on a foot launch. Is it really necessary? I'm not one to spend your money. We'll make suggestions to you as to what we might recommend. If you have any questions, then we'll certainly answer those questions honestly for you. If you're flying low and slow, which our average altitude is 4 feet off the deck to 250 feet, by the time you decide to deploy a reserve, it'd be too late. If you're flying the appropriate size glider and the appropriate glider, meaning a DHV-1 or 1-2 or an A or a B, you're fine. If you have any instances or any situation with your glider, 99.9% of the time it's going to reinflate all on its own before you could even consider tossing a reserve. Again, if the husband, wife, or girlfriend says, hey, you're not going to fly without a reserve, then get the reserve. It gives you a little bit of peace of mind. Do keep in mind, though, I have seen people that put a reserve on their machines start flying like knuckleheads. And that's because they're relying on that reserve and they're flying outside of their ability. And that can get kind of scary.
So on a foot launch unit, we just mount the reserve, whether it's on the side or in the front. I notice on the quad, though, there's a bracket. Why a bracket versus no bracket on a quad for your reserve?
That was a very good question. The reason why the quad uses a bracket is because the reserve is held so close to the ground. Remember, the quad is low to the ground. Its center of gravity is kept low, which keeps it from tipping. With the reserve mounted on the bracket, the reserve doesn't bounce around or maybe impact the ground or just get stressed. So we came up with a bracket. The reserve mounts to the bracket. It stays nice and solid through the landings and takeoffs.
Okay, so in regards to the seat, we talked about the seat belt, the bucket style seating, but what about being able to adjust it? Because we've had people that are shorter, around 5 feet tall, and we've had guys out here that are 7'1". So how could you adjust that for comfort?
Well, with the exception of the fellow last year that was 7'1", the adjustability in the seat is quite easy. During the installation, you'll put the seat rails on and you'll set the seat on top of it, and then you can slide the seat fore and aft and determine what is more comfortable for you. Sit in it, adjust it, make sure you can get full steering on it, and then you can drill the holes and put the bolts in.
With the quad and adjusting it for your legs, how tall a person is, you also have designed a quad for those who cannot use their legs. Talk about that.
Yes, we designed a quad for a customer and have since sold another one, but the front end is a caster system. So wherever you steer that glider, the front end will track with that glider. And it's amazing because it's virtually instant. The wheels will turn wherever the glider pulls it. So you don't need to steer whatsoever. We've actually thought about using that on the school here, but figured that every student needs to learn to use his feet and steer underneath the glider. The caster system does that all on its own.
So this has allowed those people that might not be able to use their legs to also paramotor.
That's true.
Tell me how this all even came about. What did they do to, for lack of a better term, I guess, alter or adjust the paraglider to help fit your needs?
Yeah, usually the powered paragliding quads are controlled with your feet.
Okay.
And so I got a hold of Mike at BlackHawk Paramotors and said, hey, I know this is how it's usually done, but I want to give it a try, and there's got to be a good way to do it. And so I just give him a call, and he said, yeah, we'll figure something out. And so they had adjusted the whole front end, so rather than having to control it with your feet, it's on casters, and it can kind of control just with the flying of the wing.
Wow. See, now, this seems super, super scary to me. But you say it was not scary. It's just super exciting.
It's super exciting.
Exhilarating.
Yeah, definitely.
We can elaborate on that a little bit, because there's guys that have lost their arms that can't steer. They can't hold the glider's toggles, but they have feet. We've implemented the machine to where they can steer the glider with their feet.
It says on the website that you'll make any modification possible to allow those that maybe have some form of handicap to experience flight.
That's correct. As far as the quad goes, we'll make any modification to it to enable somebody with a handicap to fly, and we'll do that free of charge.
I've seen the stability of the quad firsthand, okay? But tell me this, Mike. Can the quad turtle? Because a few years ago, I saw 2 trikes completely turtle when they were trying to launch in some pretty gusty wind.
Was that at Salton Sea?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that. There was a bit of carnage there. The quad. I've tapered the axles for 2 reasons. In other words, they're swept back, kind of like a jet fighter wing, so that, one, the wheels are even with the back of the cage, which is where the thrust line is from the prop. So it's pretty hard to flip something over backwards when you have that support out the back. The other reason for the tapering of the axles is that they absorb more shock.
You've covered quite a bit about the quad today, and I think the information that we discussed will be really helpful to customers.
Yes, I agree. I hope people found this informative, and if anybody would like further information, please call us at BlackHawk Paramotor USA, 209-786-7899.
The PPG discussion style format is new for us. So if you have any ideas or suggestions for future discussions, please feel free to email us at team@blackhawkparamotor.com. We'd love to get other professionals in the industry in on the discussions as well.